This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me again this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-recognized writer on the web who is the publisher of the website up2minds.com. We've had a number of series with Charles, and we've had great feedback, and I welcome you back.
Thank you, Gordon. Glad to be here.
Charles, I have up on our screen right now a roadmap which we've been using to direct our discussions, and we've covered off a lot of the building blocks on this unfortunate path to statism, which I think both of us see as a strong possibility in the future. We have a lot more to discuss in all these areas, but I thought we should shift gears this week and view this from a slightly different perspective. And I want to talk about some of the things that are less visible to the general public for a number of reasons. I want us to begin a dialogue, hopefully over the next few months, on how fiscal policy, monetary policy, and policy pressures on constitutional rights are additionally, and I mean additionally, greasing the skids of this relentless march towards growing statism. And I have up here the two different roadmaps that we've been following. And when I talk about the less visible side of it, from a fiscal policy, we're not going to get into it today, but there's so many things that have went on with stealth changes in reserve requirements, throwing out Glass-Steagall in 97, unregulated swaps market through the CFTC and some of the things that Brooks Lee-Bourne did, Dodd-Frank abomination, conservatorship of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I could just go on and on, that are fiscal policies that without question are flawed and beg a lot of questions. And we'll get into that, of this moral hazard and unintended consequences that really are fallout. And then the policy pressures on constitutional rights, the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security, executive orders and practices and budgets, the 3,500 corporations engaged in top secret and surveillance programs in America, this new, and I'm just terrified with it, this new NDAA executive orders, which is being held up in the courts. But I'm hoping that we can start to address some of those areas and put it into our roadmap. But today I really want to focus on monetary policy and the Fed specifically and its role in moving these things forward. Comments on that, what I just said, Charles?
Yeah, Gordon, I think I would summarize it as saying that what we're really discussing is the failure of central planning, and the Federal Reserve being the central controller of the currency and monetary policy. It's the ultimate agency of central planning. And so its failure is not just of its policies, but it's the whole structure of central planning. And I think that's how I would summarize our discussion today.
Right on. This is a conflict that's been going on for 300 or 400 years of the role of bankers in the central planning and the control that potentially can go with it. And our forefathers have warned us about this. And, it seems appropriate that we're talking about it this week because, in the last 2 weeks, we went to unlimited quantitative easing, which our forefathers would have never believed that unlimited printing would be allowed or tolerated. And in Europe, what they call open-ended or uncapped OMT. The Rothschilds in multiple generations made this statement, and it's so true. And the over the picture I have here in the right, top right, during the 20s, 30s, people were just were rallying against the kinds of control that was being exercised by the various powers who were controlling the money supply. These quotes here from Jefferson: if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their forefathers conquered. Pretty strong words. By the way, Charles, you just put out a paper arguing that deflation is better than inflation for the poor or for the middle class.
Yeah, for everyone whose income is not rising concurrent with inflation. But I think these quotes by Jefferson, Gordon, are interesting. They cut right to the heart of it, which is the Federal Reserve is like a strange and unique mix of state and bank power. It combines the power of the banks with the power of the federal government. And that makes it's absolutely unique in the world. There's no other central bank like the Federal Reserve that's owned by private banks and yet has federal government, power. Very bizarre.
There's not 1 in 1,000 Americans that really understand that the Fed is in fact a privately held private corporation, but it's really a merger of private-public and operates very much in the public view, but is owned privately. That doesn't mean that the owners are making away with some fortune, because the capital, in fact, is returned in a dividend to the U.S. Treasury. Because I would say that they're privately owned, that's not to say there's some real devious going on, but you need to understand that Federal Reserve is about the bank. It's about trying to create stability and maximize profits of the banking industry. And that's where the ownership comes from. And I say that, there was many books written, and I highly recommend our readers read this book, The Creature from Jekyll Isle, because it really lays out how this has evolved. When we named the Federal Reserve, we didn't want to call it a central bank because we'd had 3 central banking failures previously in the United States. So we called it a Federal Reserve. But the real power, Charles, for the Federal Reserve is not in Washington. That's a complete misunderstanding. The real power of the Federal Reserve is in New York City. It's in the Federal Reserve of New York. And that's where the FOMC operates. That's where the decisions are made. And in many ways, in fact, I do a lot of technical work. The interest rate policies follow the market. The Fed does not lead the way. In all short-term money, it's always been for years now very predictable of what they would do because of what, if you were in the credit markets, you could see what was coming. So the banks that were actually lead the way and the Fed follows from the policy standpoints and announcement we would see out of Washington. However, operating in New York City, there's a whole different structure, really, that has tremendous control, and through the other regional banks. And in that context, I would say, Charles, are you familiar with the board of directors in New York City is? Who sits on that board of the Federal Reserve in New York City? Do you think anybody knows or cares?
Yeah.
But
no.
Oh, well, if I said to you, Jamie Dimon is the chairman of the New York Fed, what would you say to that?
I'd be appalled. Yeah.
If I said to you, Jeff Immelt, the head of General Electric, sat on that board and for quite some time, and I can go through and name the people. Now, do you think? These are great American citizens, I'm sure, but don't you think there's at least some fundamental conflict of interest in here?
Yes, absolutely.
And therein lies part of the flaws. I believe they probably are trying to do the right thing from policy, but they have a certain view of things. And therein lies our problem. And it's historical in nature. It comes of how power was exercised in the country, and we're still practicing this old procedure of how we handled money, and therein lies the flaws. Is it any wonder when we went through all of the bailouts during the financial crisis in 2008 that we were bailing out the banks and huge amounts of our wealth being transferred to bail out bad decisions that the banks had made, instead of saying, no, we're putting them into bankruptcy, we're putting them into receivership, we're breaking them apart, we're moving from weak hands to strong hands, just like we did with General Motors. Why did we not do that? Oh, well, we were talking about contagion. That's garbage. You think the board of New York Fed are going to say, yeah, that's what we should do? I don't think so.
No, and I think primary point here is the control of the Federal Reserve is not in the U.S. Treasury. In other words, it's not part of the federal government that's ultimately under the control of an elected leadership. It's completely independent, and it's basically serves the banks, and that's the problem.
I have problems understanding, we had Paulson running around as the Treasury Secretary, as the former president of Goldman, and then you had Jamie Dimon buying out Bear Stearns, also now a member of the board of New York Fed, understanding how they could really feel there was no conflict of interest. I'm not trying to be accusatory here. I'm just trying to say we're putting people in very difficult positions that shouldn't be, and the system's flawed. We need to be changing some of these institutions, and until we do, we're going to have behavior that we don't want, not from individuals, but even our society, and therefore that's why some of these policies are creating moral hazard and unintended consequences that we've been talking about. And Charles, get into the mandate of the Fed, and I've got up here their dual mandate, which really is threefold, but these are words. I mean, there's no question that if they do certain things, jobs can possibly be created, but clearly quantitative easing 1, 2, and now 3, unlimited, is not creating jobs. It's not, but it's the only tool they had. And as you and I have talked about, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So their mandate sounds good, but that they can't really exercise it. They really can't deliver on their promises. And if there's any doubt in people's minds about what's going on here, here's a quote from John Wienben, the president of the German Bundesbank, who absolutely vehemently says that what they're doing with the uncapped in Europe is totally flawed. And I've got a quote here from a speech that Richard Fisher, the president of the Dallas Fed, just made on Wednesday to the Harvard Club, where he's talking about, and let me read it, quote, "Just recently in a hearing before the Senate, your senator and Harvard classmate Chuck Schumer told Chairman Bernanke, 'You are the only game in town.' I thought the chairman showed admirable restraint in his response. I would have immediately answered, 'No, Senator. You and your colleagues are the only game in town. For you and your colleagues, Democrat and Republican alike, have encumbered our nation with debt, sold our children down the river, and sorely failed our nation. Sober up. Get your act together. Get on with it. Sacrifice your political ambition for the good of our country, for the good of our children, for the good of our grandchildren. For unless you do, all the monetary policy accommodation the Federal Reserve can muster will be for naught." This was the president of the Dallas Fed and a member of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, do you think, as with John Wiedemann here in Germany, something's begging the question, is it not?
Right. And I think that the core issue here in terms of the Fed's recent pronouncement of why they want unlimited money printing is they want to fix employment. They want to create jobs. But the point here is that in making money incredibly cheap and pushing liquidity into the banks, you don't create employment. You don't encourage people to hire people. What you encourage people to do is speculate wildly, over leverage that money, and pursue the quick buck. All this money is fueling malinvestment and speculation, which are actually counterproductive in terms of creating employment. And that's the core issue.
We're penalizing savers and we're rewarding risk-taking and speculation.
Yes.
And that's blatantly obvious. Now, why is that? The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, the rich, how do they make their money? Well, they make their money on capital. They don't earn it in terms of earned income or a salary. They make it typically on capital gains and asset appreciation. Well, how do you get capital gains and asset appreciation? Well, you get it through low interest rates and a highly available leverage. Sound like today? Now, how do the poor become poor? Well, the poor in the middle class make their money typically one way. They earn it. They have an income. They have a salary. So what happens with their wealth is really controlled is real disposable income. How much does that salary actually worth to them? And how do you control real disposable income? Well, if inflation is going up, you're crushing the disposable income. If jobs and salaries aren't going up, you're crushing their income. If the costs of everything that they're having to spend in terms of food, in terms of education for their children, etc., are totally out of control, you're crushing their disposable income. So the poor in this country are becoming poorer, the rich are becoming richer. We're moving to a two-class society, and it's very simple. You can't have zero interest rate policies for as long as we've had them. Minimally 4 or 5 years now. I would argue we've had them since the tech bubble crash in 2000.
Yes, and I think that this ties into our discussion last month on inequality, that the Fed, what you're really saying here, Gordon, is that the Fed's policy and its raison d'etre, its reason to exist, is actually fueling inequality. It's creating greater inequality, and its existence is a roadblock to minimizing the inequality. because the poor and the middle class their wages are not rising at the same rate as the cost of living. And so only the top 10% are seeing their income rise.
There is no way that the Fed, by printing money, is going to create more jobs.
No.
It's just not going to happen. There's many reasons. We're a 71% consumption economy, and everybody says, therefore, it's the American consumer. But really, the consumption numbers are in the 9 trillion kind of range. If you really look and go through the flow of funds, the real purchasing is business to business, which is in the $25 trillion range. So it's businesses buying from businesses and selling to businesses the goods and services that go with it. What's happening is we're crushing the business. We've had 46,000 factories leave the United States, move to China since in the last just over a decade period of time. So the businesses themselves have a fear of investment right now, fear of risk, see the slowdown. They're not willing to move. So when you see that happen, everything starts to crush and jobs to contract, and jobs are not created, jobs shrink. Now you say to them, well, I'm going to give you more money. How is more money going to help them? That's not their problem right now. The problem is an investment climate. And it's stimulating a consumer that's having trouble with jobs is not the answer here. Trying to stimulate housing is not the answer.
Right, and trying to get people to borrow more money is not the answer, which is basically that's the whole Fed plan is to push people into borrowing more money, to increase their sense of wealth, to create the wealth effect so that we'll all run out and borrow and spend money, and that's counterproductive.
That would work, and it did work for many decades when you have a positive balance of trade and you're a strong export country, which we were. That works. Because you can, in fact, by doing that, you will actually drive more incentives because factories will expand to be able to ship and sell their goods. That's not happening in our situation right now. Therein lies the rub. Policies no longer fit the scenario, the situation, if they ever did. The question that it begs, and I would argue here, the whole Fed process and why it was established at the turn of the century. Because it was actually at the time to stop bank runs, to put liquidity into the system. Our problem right now is not liquidity. We're awash in liquidity. It's just that nobody can find an investment that merits it. There is so much malinvestment and mispricing out there. And until that's cleared and people can feel comfortable, there's not going to be solid kinds of investments. You brought some slides that really kind of show who's winning and who's not winning here because of this.
Yeah, this slide shows that the Federal Reserve loaned out or guaranteed, backed up $16 trillion to banks, and not just American banks. You'll notice Credit Suisse and Bank of Scotland and so on. That's about a little larger than the entire GDP of the United States, $16 trillion. And this was all hidden until the GAO was allowed to conduct an audit. And so when people talk about the Federal Reserve balance sheet has grown by $2 trillion, that is only the tip of the iceberg of Federal Reserve support of the banking sector. We've used this slide before, and what it shows is the tremendous concentration of assets and political power in the too big to fail banks, which are these four. And so if the Federal Reserve were functioning properly in a capitalist system, you'd think that they would be encouraging competition, and that competition does not exist here. We've got a centralized banking sector with the Federal Reserve and the too big to fail banks basically in collusion. They're a consortium at the head of our financial system.
This is where the money's going. This chart here shows $9 trillion since 2001, where it's flowed out to. And it's flowed out in the bottom, the military-industrial complex, to the banks, and to individuals. And it shows the spread with the individual where the rich have really got richer. So it says that our redistribution of wealth, which is really what politics is all about, is not putting the money in the hands that is really helping the middle class or helping the average American. Every American, I believe, today knows that somehow. So the question is, why is that not happening? I would argue we have an incorrect structure. We have a dated and old, archaic structure that with its own incentives just doesn't deliver it. And you can see that in fact, by this, as we've talked about, removing savings and forcing risk, the pressures that it's putting on, and there's the results. The interest income as a percentage of total income, just absolutely plummeting. You can imagine what's happening to the seniors and nobody's savings. So they're being very successful in their policies, but is that the correct policy?
Right. And I think we can speak very quickly to what's the basis of capitalism. And capitalism requires capital, which is savings, which is loaned out at a rate of interest that is discovered or priced by the market. And it's invested in investments that have a high yield. And what we have, thanks to the Federal Reserve, is the exact opposite of all of those policies. Capital and collateral are being disincentivized, and speculation's incentivized, and malinvestment is encouraged. And so it's no wonder that the system is failing, because we don't have capitalism. We have, actually, as we've spoken of before, we have crony capitalism, and the Fed is basically at the head of the table of crony capitalism.
Well said. What we try to do here is just to show the flawed premise and the mistaken role possibly with the Federal Reserve. And we'll do a second session here this week on the false perceptions and propaganda that's really coming out of this Federal Reserve and its role that it's currently playing. So until then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gordon.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.